Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Ron Klein. I'm chairman of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, which is the only national organization representing Jewish Democrats, advocating for policies aligned with Jewish values and exclusively mobilizing Jewish voters. No other president in U.S. history has entered office with a longer and stronger record of support for Israel than President Joe Biden. The past 3 days, we have evidenced in the marking of this president's 10th trip to Israel over 5 decades, where he has personally met with every Israeli prime minister from Golda Meir to Yair Lapid. This trip underscores President Biden's strong support of Israel's security and right to self-defense. And we were thrilled to see President Biden receive the Israel Medal of Honor for his commitment to Israel. And note that no Republican president has ever received this honor, as well as his moving visit to Yad Vashem, where he underscored his commitment to combating anti-Semitism here and abroad and the promise of never again. Joining us today to discuss this visit are 3 experts on U.S. policy toward Israel: Ambassadors Dan Shapiro, Martin Indyk, and my friend, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I'd now like to welcome JDCA board member Kevin Rader to introduce today's panelists. Kevin?
Well, thank you, Ron. I am not Kevin. I am Haley Soifer, JDCA's CEO. I think we had a technical issue getting Kevin, but I'm really happy to introduce today's speakers. We have former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, and Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who will share with us their expertise and unique insights on the president's visit to the Middle East. Ambassador Shapiro served as ambassador to Israel during the Obama administration for more than 6 years, after serving as senior director in the Middle East and the National Security Council. Ambassador Indyk has decades of experience working in U.S. policy in the Middle East after serving as U.S. Ambassador to Israel for 5 years, twice in the Clinton administration and in the Obama administration, serving as special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz is a leader in Congress on all issues of importance to Jewish Democrats, including support of Israel, as well as defending our democracy, combating gun violence, providing access to affordable health care, and defending reproductive rights. So thanks to the 3 of you for joining us today. Before we focus on Israel, I would note that President Biden is about to take the stage in Riyadh, where historically, in an unprecedented development, he flew just hours ago from Israel directly. So let's start there. And we'll start with you, Ambassador Shapiro. What can we expect from the president's speech in Saudi Arabia, which is about to start?
Sorry. Thank you, Haley, and it's good to be with everybody to talk about this historic visit. The president has landed in Jeddah, not Riyadh, for a meeting with the Saudi leadership, and then over the next 24 hours with the other GCC members, as well as leaders from Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. So it's very meaningful. And, this was not an easy decision for President Biden to make this trip to Saudi Arabia. He, of course, has been very critical of the Saudi leadership. And really, it predates the time of the current Saudi leadership. It predates the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which he was rightly outraged by, and which his government, his administration released a CIA study that appointed responsibility for that murder, a terrible murder on the Saudi leadership. So for him, this was not an easy decision to make, but I think very much the right decision as he looks at what the U.S. strategic interests are. And I think this will be reflected in his remarks. He sees at a time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the need to pull together an international coalition that resists that unwarranted aggression. Obviously, there's a strong support from NATO and other European countries, but we can't do it without other partners as well. And the Gulf partners, because of their role in energy markets, are definitely partners in this. What has gotten strained during this period of tensions in the U.S.-Saudi relationship is something that I think he's trying to reset and maybe update, which is the core bargain in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And this is what I think he'll speak to, that the United States, as a long-term partner of Saudi Arabia, will provide assurances that it will help Saudi Arabia defend itself from the very legitimate threats it faces from Iran, from Iran's proxies in Yemen and elsewhere, And there's various ways that commitment can be expressed. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia should stand as a partner with the United States when its core strategic interests are challenged, particularly by our global rivals, Russia and China. And in the current context of the war in Ukraine, that means more oil production to bring down oil prices, not to lower the price of gas at the pump, as much as we'd all like to see that, but actually to toughen the bite of sanctions against Russia and to make more non-Russian energy sources available to European markets. I think he will touch on themes that restore and update that core Saudi-US bargain. That opens the door for some of the other issues that he will also, I'm sure, reference that are still important in the relationship, but can't all necessarily be tackled at once. Still concerns about Saudi Arabia's human rights records, not only the Khashoggi murder and the aftermath, but other human rights activists who are still in prison or still banned from traveling in Saudi Arabia. The war in Yemen, which there is a ceasefire in, but which needs to be brought to a definitive end. Trying to promote additional steps by Saudi Arabia toward normalization with Israel. And it has announced today allowing Israeli civilian overflights of Saudi air territory. So there's good progress there. But I think he will touch on what's possible in this relationship once the core of the bargain is restored. Again, this isn't necessarily an easy decision for him, but because he has been a skeptic of this relationship, I actually believe he is in many ways the right person to make the case that U.S. strategic interests require a stable U.S.-Saudi relationship, and this is a step-by-step process to get there.
Thank you. And thank you for the correction. Yes, he is definitely in Jeddah, not Riyadh. Ambassador Indyk, did you have anything to add about what we might expect in the speech?
Thanks, Haley, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with JDC members today. It's a historic day, or let's say it's a historic trip. I think that the president had an excellent visit in Israel. I think the way in which he was received there, and Israelis can be pretty harsh judges of American presidents, as we've experienced in the past. But he's been overwhelmingly welcomed there. And I think the genuine warmth of his appreciation for Israel and his steadfast support for Israel for so many decades is understood and welcomed. I think that it was a big day for US-Israel relations because of the way in which President Biden, through the Jerusalem Declaration, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I would urge you to do so, made a whole range of reaffirmations of the strategic relationship with Israel and new commitments to partnerships, particularly in high tech, in the high tech area, in the missile defense area, commitments to seek funding for the new generation of air defense systems that Israel is promoting. And also, I think it shouldn't be passed up, his commitment to the two-state solution, which he made clear both in his press conference with Prime Minister Lapid at the airport arrival ceremony, and today in the West Bank in Bethlehem with Abu Mazen, where I don't know whether any of you saw the remarks he made there, but he reintroduced something that I think certainly was completely absent during the Trump years, and that is that the two-state solution should be based along the lines of June 1967 with mutually agreed swaps, language that was originally introduced by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, but President Biden has reasserted that now, and I think that's important. Just one last point to add to what Dan said about the trip in Jeddah. I think that what's important to understand here is that the president is trying to establish the strategic context, not just for relations with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, but with these other Sunni Arab states that leaders whom he's meeting tomorrow in Jeddah, what's called the GCC +3, plus Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. And the basic message that I think that he's is sending in a very clear-cut way is that the United States is not turning its back on the region, the United States is very much aware of the threat that Iran poses to American interests in the region, to Israel, and to the Sunni Arab states. And that he, as president of the United States, is going to be there to stand up with them as they stand up to face this common threat that's posed by Iran and its proxies. And this whole notion of integrated defense in the region, the Abraham Accords process that he's giving a boost to as well, in terms of steps that Saudi Arabia is going to take towards Israel that are being announced today and will be after this meeting as well, I expect. All of that serves the purpose of making clear that the United States is going to defend and promote its allies and partners in the region and their interests at the same time as it deals with an aggressive Russia in Europe and a rising China in Asia, that it's not an either-or proposition, that he's not turning his back on the Middle East, but that the Middle East is very much part of this overall strategy for meeting the geopolitical threats that the United States and its allies face.
Haley, can I just add one additional thing? Thank you so much. And thanks to JDCA for bringing together this important forum, especially given the timing. I think it's really important to note the contrast between the previous administration and this one. And President Biden is not arriving in the Middle East, either in Israel or Saudi Arabia, as a novice. This is someone, thankfully, who has deep and significant relationships and a very strategic and deep understanding of the complexities of the issues in the Middle East, both between nations and then individually. So that gives him the ability, as opposed to, and I'm certainly glad, we all are, that the Abraham Accords were able to be achieved, but those were a culmination of a lot of work that had been done in previous administrations and that were concluded during the Trump administration. I mean, this today, the fact that the President of the United States has flown for the first time from Israel directly to Saudi Arabia, I mean, that is something that I think that cannot just be, sort of mentioned as an aside. That represents progress in and of itself. And the ability, because of his relationships and his understanding of the region, to advance the possibility of adding Saudi Arabia to that trio of accords is really only achieved by making sure that we have those dialogues and build off of his knowledge, expertise, and relationships.
Thank you. Ambassadors Shapiro and Indyk, you both served as U.S. ambassador to Israel during many presidential visits spanning multiple administrations. Ambassador Shapiro, I saw you tweeted just a few days ago that a presidential visit is the highlight of any ambassador's tenure. Of course it is. But how did President Biden's visit to Israel compare to those of past presidents? And what, in your views, are the three key takeaways from his visit to Israel?
Well, there's no question that it is a highlight for any ambassador to host the President of the United States. I was able to do it a couple of times with Barack Obama, Ambassador Indyk. I was able to do it on several occasions, I think, with President Clinton. And so we were probably both feeling a little bit of envy of our successor, wonderful successor, Tom Nides, as he got to host President Biden. I'd say one thing that stood out for this visit, and it was mentioned by Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz as well, was the depth and the breadth and the sweep of President Biden's engagement with Israel over half a century, really probably even longer, because of his this was part of his identity even before he was in public office, but certainly as a public official, a senator, vice president, a president, and he's told this story about meeting Golda Meir so many times, we all know it by heart. But it really represents something unique in any presidential visit, somebody who has had that degree of depth and length and breadth of engagement. And it showed in the emotion that he expressed, and that really I think Israelis were expressing in hosting him. So it was quite meaningful in that sense. I would say the three takeaways for me from the visit are these. One is, I think if it was ever in question, and maybe for some it was, but it shouldn't anymore, it's a settled question now about whether or not the United States is committed to, and the Biden administration, to continue the process of normalization that was launched by the Abraham Accords. As I said, this was maybe something that some people were asking about early in the administration. But over the last several months, with the Negev Forum, the Negev Summit, which Secretary of State Blinken attended, followed by the launch of the Negev Forum, the follow-on meeting in Bahrain to launch the working groups that summit produced, and that will be an ongoing place where leaders will gather. Certainly, the president's participation in the four-way virtual summit during this visit with the leaders of the UAE and India shows that there's an interest in getting this regional coalition that is emerging through normalization to be linked to other U.S. partners in other regions, in this case, a major Indo-Pacific partner in India. Of course, the announcement of Saudi Arabia's permission of Israeli overflights and the settlement of this islands, the status of two islands in the Red Sea is also an important sign. Oh, the overarching theme of this whole visit is about normalization. That I think settles that question. And of course, it goes beyond what these Abraham Accords are producing in cooperation in energy and water and healthcare and education and all the different fields. It also is made possible by Israel's participation now in CENTCOM, in the U.S. military command that oversees the Middle East, which enables direct joint training and technology exchanges and meetings and other kinds of engagements between Israeli military officials and their Arab counterparts, including some countries they haven't yet normalized with. And that's the basis for doing the security cooperation on a regional basis. There's a lot of discussion around this visit about trying to launch an integrated air defense network that pools technologies and radars and interceptor capabilities across Israel, the Gulf states, Egypt, and Jordan under the U.S. CENTCOM umbrella. That's something that's also made possible by the trend of normalization. So I think that's clearly the overarching theme, and it speaks to an emerging coalition in the region of U.S. partners, all focused on similar threats, but also all focused on opportunities that they can work on together. And I think that's very, very important. The second thing, and Ambassador Indyk referenced this, is the reinforcement of the commitment of the United States to a two-state solution. That also, I don't think, was in doubt, but maybe some people hadn't heard it for a while. And certainly the president has gone a bit further than his administration has until now. He spoke, as Martin said, about the formula of the 67 lines with mutually agreed swaps. He took a number of actions that indicate that while full recognition of Israel, Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the embassy will remain exactly as they are, it does not preclude final status negotiations on the status of Jerusalem, because both sides have claims to it that must be solved at the negotiating table. And this is all in the context of a time when there's really no prospect of negotiations, and for good reasons. There's too much turmoil in the internal politics of both sides, repeat Israeli elections and a very diverse coalition, now outgoing, a real leadership struggle, succession struggle underway already in the Palestinian area. So they're not trying to bring parties back to the table and force them to negotiate. That would probably fail spectacularly, but they are trying to still hold to the political horizon of two states, to try to make clear to Palestinians that they will work to improve the conditions for them and lower the barriers to an eventual negotiation, and also to try to link what's happening in the Israeli-Palestinian arena to the Abraham Accords. That's one potential source of positive energy, even for Israelis and Palestinians, to get Palestinians, if they're willing, and they should be, to drop their objection to normalization, to come to the table, to find ways of participating and contributing, benefiting from that process. And that gets them into a conversation with Israelis and also with their Arab partners that probably will only make things easier when negotiations eventually occur. There's lots of work to do, and there should be all due modesty about what can be achieved in this area. But that's the second point. And the third point is, and this I think is really quite noteworthy in almost any foreign policy conversation nowadays, which is that these days, every foreign policy engagement, including a visit to the Middle East, is as much as anything about U.S. competition with Russia and China. The joint declaration that Martin mentioned included Israel and the United States pledging their support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Prime Minister Lapid even went further than Prime Minister Bennett had in calling out Russia's invasion. So Russia and its challenge to global security and U.S. interests in Europe is on the table in this relationship. That virtual summit I mentioned with the UAE and India is a way of linking that regional coalition in the Middle East to Indo-Pacific U.S. partners who are really focused on balancing China, or at least competing with China for influence. There was another part of that joint declaration that launched a U.S.-Israel technology cooperation initiative, but a major focus of it, it's couched in rather technical language, is on ensuring that China does not get undue access to sensitive Israeli technologies in their high-tech sector. So Israel, Russia, and China are on the table in every relationship now. That's true also in Saudi Arabia. I mentioned earlier that getting Saudi cooperation in toughening the bite of sanctions on Russia is important, and really more fundamentally, getting an assurance that Saudi Arabia will align itself with U.S. interests when they're fundamentally challenged by Russia or China, whether it's in Ukraine or Taiwan or anywhere, is really important. So that to me was new and is a reality that all of us have to get used to. That all relationships, including our closest partners and those that may be a little bit more transactional, are going to reflect U.S. priorities in those most important global competitions.
Thank you. Ambassador Indyk, how did this trip compare to past presidential visits to Israel? And what are the three key takeaways in your view?
Well, let me focus on the three takeaways just quickly. First of all, the way in which Joe Biden comes across as so human a president, much like Bill Clinton did on his visits to Israel. They announced beforehand, in typical fashion, the staff announces that there'll be no handshakes. And then, of course, the president goes and breaks that rule as soon as he gets off the plane, doing it with Bibi Netanyahu, which was a kind of interesting development. But the way in which he, at Yad Vashem, leant down to talk to these elderly Holocaust survivors, I think touched every Israeli, even the most cynical Israeli journalist was overwhelmed by the human gesture that Joe Biden made. And it resonated with Israelis for a reason that maybe some of you will remember, is that when King Hussein came to Israel after a particularly egregious attack that had taken place by a rogue Jordanian soldier, had killed some Israeli civilians, and he came to the shiva of the families that were mourning and got down on his knees to talk to them. And so I think that resonance was really important in terms of getting Israelis to feel that they had a real friend in Joe Biden. And I think Dan would agree that the Israelis have a bottomless desire to be loved by American presidents. It doesn't matter how much else you do for them. It's the love that they want to feel, and that they felt it very clearly from President Biden. And that's universal. You can just see the press coverage in Israel, universally positive in that regard. There was an interesting, what appeared to be a divergence that the press played up between President Biden and Prime Minister Lapid over the issue of Iran, where President Biden, in his remarks, emphasized diplomacy is the best way to try to deal with Iran's nuclear threat, whereas Prime Minister Lapid talked about the need, Israel's belief that there was a need for, in the ultimate judgment, if everything else doesn't work, to use force. What wasn't pointed to there in their press announcement was very clear in the declaration that the two leaders signed was that the United States committed itself, and I may be paraphrasing here rather than getting the exact wording, but it committed itself to using all means of national power necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. In other words, President Biden did something that Israel has been urging the United States to do for a long time, which is to put the option of force on the table. And that was very clear in the declaration. I think that was a takeaway that I thought was very important.
Thank you. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, as has been mentioned a few times now, President Biden and Prime Minister Lapid signed the Jerusalem Declaration, which affirmed US support for Israel's security and qualitative military edge. These are important words, but more importantly, perhaps, they will be followed up by action. And that's where Congress comes in terms of continued US security assistance to Israel, and including on life-saving missile systems like Iron Dome and the next generation of Iron Dome, which we heard about on this trip, Iron Beam. So how will Congress support this initiative and continue to support Israel's security and right to self-defense? And as well, how do you characterize support of Israel in this Democratic-controlled Senate and House?
Well, thanks for that's a really critical question, and one that really puts at the top of the list working to maintain our nation's unbreakable bond with the Democratic Jewish State of Israel. They are our most dependable Middle East ally, and support for Israel really is multifaceted. And it does mean an ironclad commitment to Israel's security, including maintaining her qualitative military edge, as well as defense against emerging threats. But it also means standing up against disproportionate, one-sided criticism and delegitimization. We thankfully, as I mentioned earlier, have a president in President Biden who really understands and articulates through his words and actions the deep connection between the US and Israel that is values-based and vibrant. The Jerusalem US-Israel Strategic Partnership Joint Declaration that was issued yesterday is really a historic reaffirmation of the foundations of the US-Israel relationship. It illustrates a vision for the future of the relationship. The declaration reflects our shared values and interests. It pledges America's commitment to Israel's security by ensuring the protection of Israel's qualitative military edge. And I'm confident that Congress will echo the vision outlined in this document, covering issues ranging from security assistance to missile defense to fighting anti-Israel discrimination to promoting normalization. What we do in Congress is through our appropriations bills each year, Congress implements the terms of the current historic $38 billion memorandum of understanding that honors the US's enduring commitment to Israel's security signed under President Obama. And following the 2021 conflict, we secured an additional $1 billion over the MOU levels in supplemental missile defense funding. I'm a senior member of the Appropriations Committee. I'm going to continue to focus with my colleagues to ensure that the MOU is a floor, not a ceiling, and that's a way in which we can make sure that our relationship and our commitment is dynamic, and that our investments in Israel's security allow her to defend herself by herself. Specifically, though, I mean, the investments that we have made paid off during President Biden's tour of Israel, and it was evident when he saw the multi-tier air defense system that includes Iron Dome, the long-range Arrow, medium-range David Sling, and he was also briefed on the new US-Israel joint initiative, the Iron Beam, which is a laser-enabled missile defense system. That's really in developmental stage, but the expectation is that it will work in tandem with systems like Iron Dome and be able to shoot down smaller projectiles. So that's another example where our two countries working together can take us to the next generation of missile defense technologies. That'll be another tool to defeat threats that are coming from both state and non-state actors.
Thank you. Ambassador Shapiro, you have written and spoken, including on this call, about the importance of regional cooperation and normalization, building on the Abraham Accords. As the president has now made this historic trip from Israel directly to Saudi Arabia, what are prospects for normalization of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudis have made pretty clear what the trajectory of this is, that they have said now publicly and indicated in lots of other ways, including the overflights decision today, including hosting some Israeli business leaders traveling on their Israeli passports, that and including some of their public statements, that they see Israel, they don't see Israel as an enemy at all. They in many ways see Israel as a partner and an opportunity. Saudi Arabia is going through a very profound transition. It's not simple. It's certainly not a democratic transition. And there are lots of issues that will remain points of controversy or even tension. But they can be a partner, certainly to the United States, in some of the ways I spoke about earlier. And they seek a partnership with Israel on two areas. One is the common security threats they face, chiefly from Iran and its proxies. There already has been Arab and Israeli, including Saudi and Israeli, joint military operations, exercise, I should say, but other kinds of exchanges that are obviously fueled by a sense that they face a common adversary. So knowing that Israel will be one of the anchors of that regional coalition, Saudi Arabia will be another, perhaps other nations will also play an important role, leads the Saudis to view Israel as a country that they hope to have a real partnership with. The other area is technology. Saudi Arabia really is aspiring under its current leadership to change its economy from being a purely fossil fuel-based economy to being a technology fueled by innovation, an economy fueled by green energy. They have very ambitious renewable energy targets this decade and in the coming decades. They, of course, like any country in the Middle East, have very profound water needs. They have a very deep concern about the food security crisis that is affecting many of their neighbors, particularly during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They, like everybody, have been dealing with the pandemic and the fallout. And they know that Israel brings an awful lot to the table in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, in terms of being helping Saudi Arabia develop its own sectors in all of these fields. And they, I think, are making clear that they intend to look for opportunities to build that relationship. Now, they could do both, a security partnership somewhat under the table, not exactly out in the open, small measures toward normalization like today is not small, but partial measures toward normalization like overflights, and do a lot of business, particularly in technology sectors, without formally normalizing relations. And there have been different indications, and at times public statements by Saudi officials, that they ultimately will seek some signals and actions by Israel that indicate that a two-state solution with the Palestinians is still on track. Maybe not all the way to the agreement, but that is still important to them. It's certainly important to the older generation of Saudi leaders. I think it still resonates to some degree among parts of the Saudi public. It's not clear if that will be an absolute requirement before a normalization occurs. Recall the UAE, before signing the Abraham Accords, made clear in an op-ed published by their ambassador to Washington in an Israeli newspaper that at that time, the possibility of Israeli annexation of the West Bank was not something that could be consistent with normalization. And when that was taken off the table, normalization proceeded very quickly. So there may be other partial ways of signaling that this priority, which remains a priority for Saudis and for others in the Arab world, is still on track, short of a final status agreement that will facilitate normalization. These are decisions that I think the Saudi leadership is thinking about, is weighing, of course, interacts with their relationship with the United States and things they seek from the United States. Obviously, if the Saudis do proceed all the way to normalization, even the partial steps, it makes it even more likely that other Arab states and even non-Arab Muslim states will follow suit. They still have a great deal of influence in the Arab and Muslim world. Many other countries are looking at their actions, will follow their lead, or at least be influenced by their decisions. So this is a very promising development that President Biden has been able to help shepherd these partial steps, and his own flight from Tel Aviv to Jeddah. I'm hopeful that these, in the next phase, the Saudis will find additional platforms to show that this is the trajectory they're on, even if we don't know the exact timetable to get to the final destination.
Thank you. Ambassador Indyk, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, earlier today, President Biden visited with President Abbas in Bethlehem, and he announced a number of initiatives to support the Palestinian people, including a new multi-year U.S. contribution for the East Jerusalem Hospital Network and additional aid for the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, to continue delivering critical service to Palestinian refugees. What is the significance of these new initiatives and this assistance, especially after all aid to Palestinians and UNRWA was effectively cut and frozen in the last administration?
Thanks, Haley. If I can just add one thing about the Israeli-Saudi relationship. This agreement that's been reached about the islands in the northern part of the Red Sea is not easily understood. But I think the point that I would emphasize about this agreement, which has been broken by the Biden administration between Israel and Saudi Arabia, commits Saudi Arabia to maintaining freedom of navigation for cargoes headed to Eilat. So while we're all focused on, understandably, on the issue of flyovers, rights, and perhaps I think we'll hear that there'll be direct flights for Muslims from Israel and from the Palestinian territories to be able to fly from Israel to Jeddah and make the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is close to Jeddah. This commitment by Saudi Arabia to freedom of navigation for Israel and Israeli cargoes bound for Israeli ports, is a significant indication of normalization that isn't, I think, commonly understood. Now, for the Palestinians, as you point out, the president announced new aid commitments to the Palestinians, particularly to East Jerusalem hospitals, who have been unable to pay their bills for looking after West Bank Palestinians because the Palestinian Authority can't afford to pay those bills. And so this is urgently needed relief, and I think much welcomed by the Palestinian hospitals and those in the healthcare sector on the Palestinian side. I think that, there's an understandable disappointment on the Palestinian side that there isn't something more tangible on the political level. But we're just facing a reality at the moment with the Israeli polity heading into elections in the next 4 months, with the Palestinian polity deeply divided between Hamas, that promotes a one-state solution that is without Israel, and the Palestinian Authority that's committed to a two-state solution. There isn't really a way to get to final status negotiations from here at the moment. But instead, the president made clear his commitment, his administration's commitment to the two-state solution based on the 67 lines with mutually agreed swaps. He also made interesting comments about Palestinian and Israeli shared affinity to Jerusalem and its the holy city, and I think the very fact of him going to these East Jerusalem hospitals was a way of signaling that he recognizes that the Palestinians have aspirations in Jerusalem for their own capital of their state eventually. He didn't say that, but I think that the visit there is kind of a signal in that direction. But in terms of doing doing more on the political level. I think his focus is on trying to move both sides to take steps that can help to create an environment in which negotiations can occur further on down the road. If Prime Minister Lapid is successful in getting elected as Prime Minister, then I think we will see a movement on the Israeli side that the administration will be able to get behind. But in the meantime, there's not a lot that the United States the president should do in circumstances where the Israelis are about to go to the polls, except to reiterate his firm commitment to a state solution and to taking steps, tangible steps that will help improve the lives of Palestinians in the meantime.
Great, thank you. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. Yesterday in Israel, President Biden reaffirmed his commitment to preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and his opposition to removing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, from the US list of foreign terrorist organizations. How do you think these announcements regarding his policy toward Iran will be received on the Hill? And how is this policy with regard to Iran generally viewed in Congress, which I know has been recently briefed by the administration about their efforts to negotiate a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA?
Well, I think the answer depends on who you ask, because the reality is that there is a hazy lens over the eyes of some members of Congress, preventing them from having what should be a genuine reaction of support for the notion that the President of the United States, has absolutely declared that he will never allow Iran to achieve a nuclear weapon and acquire a nuclear weapon, and his opposition very clearly to removing the IRGC from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. So you would think that that should be universally received positively. Unfortunately, and this being the Jewish Democratic Council of America with the large D, I want to stress that what is unfortunate is that, I mean, if you're asking Republicans on the other side of the aisle, to be honest, privately, they're going to say that, they're glad to see that. But unfortunately, Republicans often try to make Israel a political weapon or a political football. And so, there's a lot of mealy-mouth, equivocating, and criticism about other things. And so it gets very muddy on their side of the aisle. But I mean, for me, I have had private and public conversations with the administration, as have other Democratic members, that it's absolutely essential that we not delist the IRGC. That would be detrimental to our national security interests, certainly to Israel's. I'm not surprised, but I'm certainly pleased that they were obviously listening. And knowing President Biden, as I am fortunate enough to do, it doesn't surprise me that he has maintained them on that list. It's just, and I mentioned I'm given the nature of the difference in our roles, the three of our roles. I think it's important for me to stress that all of the progress that we have the potential to make and that we have made is really dependent on our maintaining Israel as outside of American political decision making. It hurts Israel for us to become political when it comes to, and to be, to try to use it as a strategic weapon to have one side, best the other. We have to make sure that we can advance the prospects for peace when that is possible. We have to make sure that we honor the the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship and our commitment to allow them to maintain their qualitative military edge, to make sure we can keep them, in a position where they can defend themselves by themselves. And really, the threat of Iran looms. I think we have to proceed carefully, as thankfully President Biden has, when it comes to how and whether we return to the Iran agreement, the JCPOA, and above all else, we do have to make sure that Iran never achieves their goal of acquiring nuclear weapons.
Thank you. We definitely share your view with regard to opposing Republicans' use of Israel as a political football, something we've been saying for a long time. Appreciated your thoughts on that. Ambassador Shapiro, you served in the Obama administration at the time that the last MOU, the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding, was finalized, which affirmed U.S. assistance over a 10-year period totaling $38 billion to Israel. The Jerusalem Declaration included language that referenced a follow-on MOU to address emerging threats and new realities. And it's hard to believe that first 10-year MOU may be coming to an end in a few years here. What can we expect from a follow-on MOU, and have negotiations on such an agreement effectively begun with this agreement that the President and Prime Minister signed?
Well, the dialogue between the United States and Israel over Israel's security needs is constant. It's ongoing. It's deep and broad across throughout the security establishments of both countries. And it means there's constant assessments being made about even how to spend the money in the existing MOU. So when President Obama visited Israel in 2013, I believe it was about year 5, about year 5 of the previous MOU. I think we're on the 3rd or 4th of these MOUs now. Usually they last 10 years. And in that visit, he and then Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the launch of negotiations toward the next MOU, even though we had about 5 years lead time until it would need to be agreed to. But they both wanted to get it done during President Obama's second term. Sounds like they're getting ready to have the initial discussions to prepare the negotiations for the next MOU. But this is a long process, and there's no reason to rush it. In fact, there's a lot of reason to allow it to unfold over some period of years, because you want this MOU, when it's signed, to be as relevant to the existing security requirements and the existing threat picture when it takes effect. And so we still have about 6 years to run on the current MOU. But it's very valuable to start those conversations now. And following that visit by President Obama, the IDF arranged a series of briefings for U.S. officials, which were the most detailed laydown of IDF capabilities and the order of battle and systems that they had developed themselves, and systems that they hoped to acquire, and plotted against the threats as they saw them evolving in the years ahead. And that was extremely helpful. It was really necessary for the United States to get a full understanding of Israel's security needs and goals. It also allowed the United States then to take that into account as it thought about its own internal budget procedures and what it could produce in the follow-on MOU, which ultimately produced that $38 billion. We spent about 3 years negotiating. On and off, there were periods that it was less active. But in the end, that agreement was signed in the fall of 2016. It didn't take effect until 2019. So to sign a new agreement, maybe toward the end of President Biden's first term or sometime in his second term, would still be within the time frame of the existing MOU. There's an advantage, as I said, to starting the conversations early, to going deep on what the needs and requirements are, but also project that against threats as they will evolve. And then with some number of years left on the existing agreement, to sign the next agreement so that the necessary planning can go ahead for acquisitions that will be made using the next MOU's funds. I'm perfectly confident that this administration and their Israeli partners are going to have very fruitful and very collaborative discussions on how to structure the next MOU. Exactly the timing of when it will be signed, I think it's sort of too early to know, even too early to know whether that's desirable in the next 2.5 years. But it's very, very advisable to get the conversation going even now.
Thank you. Ambassador Indyk, you recently wrote a book, I happen to have it right here, about Secretary Kissinger and the art of Middle East diplomacy, called Master of the Game. So 40 years after many of the stories that you write about in this book, so at 40 years after then Secretary Kissinger's tenure, what are some similarities and maybe differences between his approach and that of the Biden administration to the Middle East?
Well, thank you for that question, Haley, and that promotion of my book. It's unexpected, but highly appreciated. It actually reminds me of a story that hasn't appeared, it appears in my book, but hasn't appeared in the accounts of the last few days of President Biden's long relationship with Israel, going back to his first meeting with Golda Meir, which is the thing that gets most attention. But in 1975, Secretary of State Kissinger negotiated a second agreement between Israel and Egypt. It was the Sinai Interim Agreement, in which Israel had to evacuate the strategic passes, the Mitzvah passes in the middle of the Sinai. And the United States placed technicians there to run early warning stations so that the Israelis would know if the Egyptians were crossing the canal and could mobilize and move in passes to take them back again. And that required congressional approval to put those American technicians in. And there were a series of hearings. The vote eventually passed after 6 weeks of deliberations, overwhelmingly. And there were 2 senators who opposed it. Senator Mike Mansfield, who was the leader of the Democrats in the House, and a freshman senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. And his reason for opposing it was that he was opposed to foreign entanglements. So you can fast forward to his position on ending the war in Afghanistan and see that there's a consistency in Joe Biden's approach to foreign policy, even so. But when it comes to comparison between those days and now, and Kissinger's approach and Biden's, is actually very strong similarity. As I explained in the book, Kissinger's approach was incremental, step by step. He did not believe that it was possible to jump to a final status negotiation and agreement, but rather that it would take some time to end the conflict, for the 2 sides to build trust in each other and be willing to take the necessary risks and compromises and make concessions necessary for a final agreement. So he wanted to take it slowly, step by step. And the interesting comparison with now is that, as I explained earlier in this conversation, it isn't possible to jump to a final status agreement between Israelis and Palestinians now. Previous administrations, including those that I was involved in, tried and failed to do that. In fact, 4 presidents have tried and failed in that regard, including, of course, President Trump. And that hasn't been possible. And so we are now reverting, President Biden is reverting to a step-by-step approach, incremental steps that help to improve the lives of Palestinians, as I explained, that help to build confidence between Israelis and Palestinians. It was interesting to see last week that Prime Minister Lapid, for the first time, I think in maybe 7 to 10 years, Prime Minister Lapid called President Abbas, Abu Mazen, to wish him greetings on the occasion of the Eid al-Adha, the Eid holiday. And that was accompanied by Defense Minister Gantz going to visit with Abu Mazen to talk about the kinds of steps that can be taken. As you may know, Israel has now allowed some 150,000 Palestinians from the West Bank to come in to work in Israel every day, and is allowing some 20,000, taking it up to 30,000 Gazans to now work in Israel. These are developments that were unheard of even 1 year ago. That is making a dramatic difference to the economies, keeping the economy of the West Bank alive, and now boosting the economy in Gaza as well. And that's making a tangible difference. It's not economic peace. It's not meant to be economic peace as some in Israel would like to portray it, but it's rather designed as a way to move towards the rebuilding of trust and the rebuilding of cooperation, such that further on the line, down the line, a final resolution of these very tough issues can be contemplated. And that is a Kissingerian approach to peacemaking.
Thank you. It was not planned, but I happen to have the book here, and it is a good read. Thank you for that. So now we're going to ask our final question to all three of our panelists. We have talked about so much substance related to this trip in the past hour. And for our hundreds of Jewish Dems who tuned in today and others watching on C-SPAN, what is the one key takeaway that you want to leave with the audience in terms of the significance of this trip? And Congresswoman, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Haley. This has really been an incredible opportunity, and rare, all too rare, to be able to dive into this much substance and not just really focus on the surface level. My few key closing thoughts are one, we have to restate the obvious, and that is that President Biden's strong support and commitment to the state of Israel fully on display to the entire world, and as is the U.S.-Israel relationship. That is widely known both in Israel and in the United States. It was demonstrated by the really incredibly supportive response by the Israeli people. And the trip itself has been an opportunity for him to reaffirm and reinforce that as President of the United States, he has prioritized and will continue to make sure that the U.S.-Israel relationship remains strong. And we're at a critical moment in the world with the turbulence we're facing, at a period of geopolitical competition, at a time when there are significant challenges that we're confronting, from climate and energy to food to nuclear proliferation. We have to deepen and intensify our engagement and relationship with our closest allies and partners in the world, and not sort of retreat into a cocoon. And doing that is essential, because Israel is our partner, not just in security, but across the full range of issues like science, technology, and agriculture. And we need to make sure that we more tightly weave and create more opportunities to bring in to the quilt of those important relationships in the Middle East, so that we can not only ensure Israel's security, but our national security interests and a more peaceful and prosperous world more generally. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, Congresswoman, for your strong support of the U.S.-Israel relationship and so many issues that are of importance to Jewish Democrats. Ambassador Shapiro.
Thanks as well for the opportunity to speak to your members today, Haley, and thanks for all you're doing. I would say the takeaway for me is that the overarching theme of this very successful trip, successful so far on the Israel side, and I think it will be met with additional successes in Jeddah, is regional integration. It's a recognition by the administration that there are several trends underway that they are able to harness, that they are able to advance, that they are able to help serve the interests of the countries of the region, but also the interests of the United States. We mentioned the normalization agreements, of course, signed during the previous administration, but now strengthening and warming and broadening with this negative forum. We've mentioned the Saudi overflight decision. We've mentioned linking this regional coalition to partners outside the region. We've mentioned the security coordination that takes place now under CENTCOM with Israel as a member, and which will hopefully include a more integrated air defense. We really see the possibility of the emergence of a regional coalition supported by a whole multilateral architecture that has never existed in the Middle East before. That's what other regions have. The European Union, there's ASEAN in Southeast Asia. Other regions have a regional organization where countries come together at every level: heads of state, foreign ministers, finance ministers, ministers of health, education, energy, water, and so forth. There are civil societies, there are universities, there are companies engaged together collectively. They strengthen what goes on internally within that coalition, and they strengthen themselves as a bloc, dealing with other regions together and helping solve global problems. That is something we've never seen before in the Middle East, but it is beginning to happen. And the administration is smartly putting itself actively in the center of efforts to advance that. If the U.S. is the lead partner to that emerging coalition, it will position us to get the most out of that coalition for itself and for our own interests, and certainly to ensure that it is properly aligned with the United States and against our global competitors. So this is we may look back at this period of time 5 or 10 years from now and see that something that was really unimaginable in the Middle East was getting going and getting active, and now has the strong bipartisan support within the United States to make the full investment in that regional coalition.
Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing your insight. We deeply appreciate it. Ambassador Indyk.
So, I think that Americans who care about Israel want to know whether the president, who has the ultimate decision when it comes to acting in ways that can help defend Israel and help it defend itself by itself, whether he feels a commitment to Israel in his gut. It's the gut test, the Kishka's test. And I think that my takeaway from this trip is that President Biden has demonstrated in a totally genuine way that he gets it. He understands the importance of Israel. He understands the importance of standing by Israel. And he's done it for 4 decades, and he intends to continue to do it in all the ways that he can as president. He demonstrated it a little more than a year ago when Hamas rockets started falling on Israel, and despite criticism that he got even within our own party, he stood by Israel. He put his arm around Israel, and he brought that conflict to an end much more quickly than would have happened otherwise, because of his understanding of that. And he showed that in so many different ways on this trip. So that is the essential takeaway. I think we should all feel very good about the fact that our president is a genuine supporter of Israel, understands its needs, including its need for peace with the Palestinians, and is committed to doing everything he can to ensure the survival and well-being of the Jewish and democratic state. I think we should all be very happy with the results of this trip.
Thank you. Thanks to all 3 of our panelists. Thanks to the hundreds of you who joined us today for our discussion on President Biden's trip to the Middle East. Events like this are crucial for our community to stay informed on issues of importance to Jewish Democrats, and we encourage you to visit jewishdems.org to learn more about how you can get involved with our organization. And as we close out today's program, I want to remind everyone that between now and November 8th, specifically, we will be mobilizing nearly 2 million Jewish voters to get out the votes to elect those who share our values, including strong support support of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And with that, I want to wish everyone thanks for joining and Shabbat Shalom.